All right, what we're going to talk about today is messaging. How to know if your message is the problem. Why is that important? Well, that's important all the time because if you're in product marketing, I consider this an essential part of your job. If your messaging isn't on point, you're not doing your job well. It's just pretty certain. There's nobody else in the organization that owns a particular part of the messaging other than you. That's not product's job, that's not marketing's job, that's not sales jobs, that's your job. So this is the one that you have to ensure that you nail right. So with that, let me do a brief introduction. My name is Becky Trevino. I'm the Executive Vice President of Product. I lead product marketing, product management, user experience, and product analytics at Snow Software, which is an IT asset management and FinOps leader. Positioning, the best way I describe Snow is if you're familiar with Rocket Money or Truebill that looks at all of your subscriptions, we're that for enterprise. We help organizations manage their software, cloud, and spend. All right, with that, a little bit about me. We've talked about companies across where you've worked. So I started my career, I'm an engineer by background. I started my career at Dell, and I ended up in my first senior product marketing role at Dell. And I think about its scale. So Dell is a multi-billion-dollar organization. We had hundreds of products. I think someone mentioned in the previous session, multi-product marketing. We had hundreds of products. So you had that extreme specialization of product marketing skills where you were the niche section of that particular product. And so that was a certain skill set because at that scale of a business, you're really trying to understand your little sandbox and do it really well. I moved over from Dell into Rackspace, who was a pioneer in cloud computing. And from there, I grew up the ranks to eventually become a senior director of product marketing. There, we really were an interesting one because each individual, we grew into business units, and each individual business unit had a lead of product marketing. So I was the lead of our, we were a $3 billion company. I had the largest product line at about $1.5 billion. And that was an interesting experience because at that one, you're almost kind of battling against the other product marketing leaders over who gets mind share into a marketing organization. And if you're at a big company, I don't know how many of you are, you know exactly what I'm talking about because you're trying to get into mind share of who's getting into that campaign, who gets to get in the speaking point at the event, and that gets fun. And after a while, I grew a little bit tired of that and then moved over to a company called Snow, and I wanted to lead the entire function. So I ended up joining Snow. I led global product marketing. At that point, when I took over the product marketing side of it, I owned packaging and pricing, as well as the core product marketing skill sets of that. And I ended up growing out of that role, getting into product operations, and being kind of a product person by background. When the opportunity came up, I ended up leading all of product. So it's one of those people that I do believe that product is a career path for product marketing. I've seen a couple of folks, at least in my network, that have been it, and I'm one of those people that went beyond the CMO path into more of the chief product officer path. All right, so we came here for messaging. So these are my views of 3 signs you may have a messaging problem. And I'm gonna leave it to Beth to tell me because I don't have the little timer of when I'm done here. So if you give me that 5-minute mark. The 3 signs you may have a messaging problem. Well, I think core is if you're missing your objectives. If you're underperforming on your key performance indicators, and that depends on your OKRs of what you're going in, but if there's some key parts of that, you should always be thinking about, well, is it positioning? Is it messaging? Is there somewhere in there that I'm not getting that hook? So that should be number 1 sign. You should always ask you, it's one of those 2, something isn't working right. There's also a really tricky one, or your call input metrics. So things like, hey, page views, conversion, they're going well, but you're not meeting your revenue targets for your particular product. So everything that technically should be going right are green, but at the end of the day, you're not seeing that conversion into close won revenue. That's another sign. And sometimes this is a trickier one to pan out because I've been in these situations where it's like, well, technically what all I own is green, what's going on? And so this oftentimes ends to be something. If there's something in the sales cycle, there's something in the funnel that you're not really bringing in the right people, and at the end of the day, sales is wasting some time around conversion. And then the third is, you're going after a particular target audience, but you're attracting a whole other one. Something is going to float there, and it could be that message that you're not going in. So these are typically, I'm sure there's more, but these have been at least ones for me when I'm thinking about, hey, is my messaging not on point? Usually these are one of the indicators. Okay, so we talked about what you see. What do you do? So in this, I'm going to make the broad assumption, if this is a product messaging sequence, that you've gone through this exercise, you're aligned with the positioning. So I always think when you go through a messaging exercise, you start with positioning, you kind of know that center of who you are, you move on to messaging, and this is very clear that oftentimes it's important to understand as a product marketer, messaging is not synonymous with copy. You know, you put in what the requirements are into your messaging structure. It's up to another department and or you, it could be you, if it were depending on to make sure that the copy is right. What you're going to put on the website, what you're going to put into the pamphlet, that has to sound right, but that isn't always what needs to be in the messaging structure. So I differentiated those two, but we're going to focus in specifically, this is the topic of this conversation. So put your messaging hats on. So why is messaging so hard for us to get right? I started this conversation by this is our job. So if it's our job, why are we failing at it? What are we doing that's not making it right? We're smart people. We come to PMA conferences. We probably follow people who are influencers on LinkedIn. We read up about it. So why is it so hard? Why do we keep talking about it? I would argue it's death by messaging house. Let's make a thing of this. Everybody has a variant of something that looks like this. Let's raise our hands. Who has something that looks like this, saved somewhere, some template? Okay, the people who don't, what do you use? You know, like, follow me, Pastor. I want to know, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, what do you use? Somebody has a variant of this. And my argument is that oftentimes you end up in poor positioning and messaging because you spend more time. Somebody comes in and says, oh, the template needs to be completed because marketing needs this for campaigns or sales needs this for enablement. And you feel under pressure and you fill out some stuff. And you talk to this person, you talk to that person, you looked at the competitive website, you looked at some other stuff of what somebody had, your predecessor, and you fill this out and it looks nice and you feel good about it. But you didn't do the market research that it took to make sure that the inputs into that were any good. You didn't validate it. You took whatever the competitor was talking about, you thought that that was good. You put anything that the predecessor talked about and you thought that was good. You didn't invest the time into the market research. And that's usually what happens is you feel good, but the reality is even though you can check the box that the marketing messaging house is done, it's not really done. So this lands me on what I call the 3 rules of product marketing to get that messaging house to work, because those signs aren't working because you don't know it. And I'm not going to ask you how many of you know that because you should be honest to yourself. Do I know it? If no, let's pay more attention. So the 3 rules of product marketing are know your customer. If you don't know your customer, you're not in the room. You need to understand your customer. You need to understand your product. This is where product marketing, 9 out of 10 times that I talk to product marketers, why they fail. They think the PM needs to know the product. The sales engineer needs to know the product. No, you need to know the product. You should make it a goal that you should be as good as the best salesperson in your organization at demoing the product. Typically, product marketers are too soft on this. You don't get it, and you need to get better at it. Even if it's technical, step it up. The salespeople have to step it up. You have to step it up. Know your market. This is a 3rd one. This is the knowing the market is what distinguishes a good product marketer from a great product marketer. The great product marketers in the industry understand their market just as good. Like I'll tell you for me personally, I can go in a room, that's why I own product right now. I can go into a room right now I always was invited to a seat at the table at the product management one. I never had difficulty with product management having a seat at the table. Why was that? Because I added value. Because I could sit there and talk about what our top competitors were doing. I understood what sales needed. I understood why we weren't winning in the market, because we're all in the business of selling software. And product management couldn't be everywhere, and they felt like product marketing has my back covered. Know your customers. Let's start there. So here's kind of where we start when I think about knowing your customer. What do you need to know? Every organization has what I call an ideal customer profile. You know, in product marketing, you're either inheriting this or you need to understand and define this. If you're typically a startup, there's some wonderful parts about it if you're a startup, because you don't have any of this stuff built, but you have some really smart people at that, because the founder is somebody that you should be really close to. The founder knows the problem he or she was trying to solve in market. He knows who he was trying to solve it for. You need to tap into that to understand who it is, and then work with those that are in RevOps and product management to really refine that. That's where your role needs to be, to really understand that you're getting that into play. But the also magic of it that really needs to play in, because a lot of times I see product marketers stop there, is really understanding the impact of executive sponsors and critical stakeholders. But you can't get message completely right unless you understand both of those groups. The other part about it comes in on understanding what matters to your ideal customer profile. What's going to get them to buy? And ideally that starts with business outcomes. And if you follow any of the influencers or products, outcome, outcome, outcome. But there's more than just outcome. You got to understand the blocks, because we'll typically say, whoa, it's about problems. Understand the problems, the job's to be done. And that's true. But you got to really understand that block in the middle. Because what's the gap between the outcome? It's like, I want to run a marathon. Great, I want to run a marathon. But my current situation is I haven't run in a while. Well, why haven't I run in a while? That's what you need to tap into. Because my problem is I haven't run in a while. My outcome is I want to do the marathon. But why haven't I? Why don't I have time? Or I haven't prioritized it. That blockage is where the true understanding of the persona happens. And then the other one, where the executives come in, is you have to understand how important is it to the business to meet this outcome. Because if it's important to the champion, but not important to the business, and you're getting wishy-washy there, then you know that you need to spend more of your time of your messaging figuring out how to make what your business does a higher priority for the intended executive champion. Because what's going to happen is that one, where all input indicators are green, but you don't convert because the champion doesn't see value enough in there to pay for it and sign on the check. That's how number two of the indicators happen. So you got to ensure, does the executive sponsor, what's in it for them? Is there a promotion? What's in it? Is it that they're going to save things? That's where the risk, that's where the magic. This is the art of product marketing, is understanding what's in it for them. Because we can spend a lot of time at the science, but unless you get those top two, in particular that bottom part, that's the art. How to best know how to know your customers better. So a lot of times in product marketing, we kind of stop around, well, I talk to sales. Sales knows a little bit, but you need to know more. So to deeply understand these customers, you need to find a way to talk to customers. Especially as I've moved into product, I realized that product marketing doesn't talk to customers. You use middlemen to talk to your customers. You need to stop and figure out a way to deeply understand those buying triggers, pain points, and purchase criteria. You also need to find out who your best sellers are in your organization. You need to get mentored by them, understand that you really win, learn closely from them. And then the other one, we often focus on why we lose. I always think the product marketers spend way too much time on why you lose. You need to know why you win. Because the people that win, they love you. You want more of those. That's an ICP. Follow influencers and vendors in your space. That's a quick way, if you're like burnt out and looking at social media, that's a quick way to get a feel for what's going on in your market and what's hot to your customers. But okay, you did all that. You're still not ready. Still not ready for that messaging, that piece to really nail that messaging block. This comes next. Let's know your product. That we may not all understand, product goes through a significant process to get a product approved into development. And product marketing oftentimes tends to miss out on all of this because you're like, oh, someone has something on the roadmap. What are you ready to launch? Give me the insights. You're not invited to any of this. There's the product marketing management triad. It's product management, engineering, UX. You're not included. You're not invited. So if you're not invited, you need to ensure that you're getting that input. Why is product building this? Who are they trying to solve? Whose problems are they trying to solve? What's the blockage? Why did they think this was important? What are those differentiators? Don't just take what product teams give you, head nod, and be like, we're going to launch for that. That's going to make you an okay product marketer. And if you're sitting here today, I assume you want to be great. And unless you understand this, you won't be. So you really need to dig in with your product managers. And the only way that you're going to have credibility to do this, if you understand the product. Typically, when you understand the product, you've understood the components of product discovery, what you do is it's essential to really link back. What's that business outcome? Because why you want to know the inputs from discovery is really to be able to nail down and understand why did they get to that value prop? Why did they think? Why did my peers think this was important? And then what outcomes based on my customer research and my market research, how do I connect those two? Because that's where good messaging sings, is the ability to bring those two together. What our company thinks is important, what we do with the business outcome that our ideal customer profile wants to reach. That's the magic. And this is what you should feel, that emotion. You feel like, I understand why you built this and for whom. And if you don't, coming out of that discussion with product, keep digging. Feel the confidence to keep digging into that. And then, again, I keep referencing the magic because product marketing is both an art and a science. The art is understanding the underlying emotions, that motivators, the what's in it for them that I spoke about earlier. Why do they want that? Why do they need this? How will they make their lives better? There's an industry example when I was at Rackspace, what I did around a PMM workshop. I got to the point where we were just having a lot of debate around messaging. I actually didn't sit there in a hole by myself and make the thing. I'm a product marketing lead. I was a senior director then. I said, let's just get everybody in a room. I got marketing, engineering, product, UX, customer success, and I held a messaging workshop. I separated them into groups, and I walked out with something better than I would have in a room all by myself. So sometimes when things are ambiguous enough and you have some really strong innovation in market or the messaging just isn't working with all of you together, sometimes it's best to bring all of you together because the insights from those different sides of the group sometimes really work better than you trying to sit there in a computer desk all by yourself making it happen. Finally, it's really not enough to understand the product and the customers by itself. You really need to be at a point where you understand how you fit in the broader dynamic of things, how you actually fit in a world where your competitors lie in. So this is where I put in, here's your product, and obviously we love our product. That's one side note. And when you're looking for jobs, and unless you're like really in a tight crunch, it's like you need cash. If you need cash, you go do what you need to do. But if you're like, have options, and you're like, I'm currently working at a place, unless you can really love your product, don't take that job. Because you gotta really love it. To be really good at the messaging part of it, you gotta love it. You gotta love that, what it symbolizes, what it solves. I think it was, I remember she's the one who runs Punchy. I follow her on LinkedIn. She was like, somebody who runs, I think her latest LinkedIn post was that when you love the customer, then you really can actually connect to them. And if you don't love the product, if you don't love the customer, that makes for a really tough time to make messaging. But with this comes in around your vendors. Your vendors, you don't want to copycat what they write, but you also have to understand what they write and how your product fits into what they're doing. Because if they're all talking about something and you're not even including it, that's really confusing for the prospect. Because the prospect starts understanding, well, vendor 1 says this, vendor 2 says that, vendor 3 says that, but vendor 4 over there, they don't. Why is that? Do they not offer that? So you start getting confusion. So there has to be, can't be copycat, but there has to be some level of alignment around what you're going in with the broader market. And then there's your business outcome. And that's the magic, right? You have to talk within it. You've understood your business outcome. You understood your blockers. You understood what your product's value proposition is. You're understanding your vendor piece. And it's really those differentiators, how you can actually help your customer reach that business outcome better than any of these other solutions. So in this spot, you understand, their problem. You know their needs, their aspirations, and you know what you do better than anybody else. That's the foundation of strong messaging. So now you have that. Now you can actually go back here because you've done all of the research. And this is actually one of those challenges of B2B. So if you think about consumer goods like CPG, how many of you watch Mad Men before? Back in the day, brand companies used to have a lot of money to go run focus groups, to go do a lot of these things. And oftentimes in B2B, you get zero budget to do any of these things, and you're struggling. But that doesn't mean that those focus groups, that market research isn't necessary for you to do that strong messaging and positioning. They're as essential. Unfortunately, you just have less money to go do it or timeline. But you have to find a way to bridge that gap if you really want to have strong messaging in market. I think then once you've actually have that foundation of messaging, you have that foundation of I can actually feel confident that this messaging framework that I've built is good, then comes the hard part. I created this framework for my own teams, and I was just saying, look, product marketing, product management, you own the what. The rest of the teams, they own the how. Don't be the product marketer that goes and tells the marketing team that needs to be a webinar. That's not your job. You're supposed to tell them what, hey, there's something hot going on. They decide whether it's a webinar, a social activity, et cetera, within that. But what's really important, what I see a lot with messaging frameworks, is that they live in Teams, OneDrive, in their dead documents. Instead of living documents, they're dead. You've fulfilled a quota that somebody told you that you needed that at a launch or something, and we all felt good at ourselves because at that moment in time the messaging framework was good, but you didn't keep it up to date. That's another way that if you've done all this work, but you don't keep that as a living document, that's another way that your messaging gets old and tired and you don't end up meeting what you need to meet. So this is one thing to reach out with. How are you gonna, you've got the what lives in that messaging framework. How are you going to disseminate that with your other groups and keep that a live document? Particularly with agile development on the product management side, where they're likely introducing or shipping something new every 2 to 3 weeks. How do you keep that a live document, both on the product management side of your house, as well as the marketing, sales, and customer success end? That's an important way of almost keeping yourself honest about keeping those messaging frameworks alive, is really understanding the results of each sprint, the added value from each sprint, and interjecting those to see if your messaging frameworks need to change. The final thought here is it's really, you've done a good job putting that messaging framework together, you've done the research, you understand, you have a good sense of who your customer is, what your product, that value proposition that it does, how that essence works across the market. You kind of have a framework in place of how marketing, sales, customer success could use the research that you've identified to really help drive conversion. But sometimes, it isn't enough. You need to continue to keep that a living document. You need to test. This is where many of you have heard of like Winter. This is where things like Winter come into play. I've seen some product marketing managers try to replace Winter with their brains. That's why I started this with saying, if you go to Winter and you just don't have a good messaging framework that you've done any research for it, that's not going to teach you anything. You've only wasted money because then you're going to have to keep going back there until you get it right. You have to actually have an idea of starting with a good framework for that to actually be a good test. So definitely continue to test, whether that's A/B testing, whether that's using, a focus group like Winters, which you already have it. There's a lot of ways in which you can get it. It could simply be doing a mock-up of a website sometimes, because nobody has more opinions than when you introduce messaging into copy and then say, hey, this is what the product page is going to look like. Suddenly, people who didn't want to have an opinion on your messaging frameworks have a lot of opinions on what that website says. And then you can know, like, hey, do my best sales teams, do my best other people, do they really understand and know that? That's really where you could get a feel for that if you don't have any budget to use something like a Winter, or it's really tough to do. I'm still relying on you to tell me in terms of where this comes in terms of A/B testing, et cetera. You don't have access to the digital person that can help you. So that's a quick way, what I found. All right, since I think I'm done, Beth didn't tell me I had 5 minutes, if you're ready to message, I'd love to hear about it. I built this deck on a Tuesday, so I'm sure there's some things that I missed of what it is. So let me know if anything that I've done today is helpful to you. Win for you, I think, is accountability of driving really good messaging into your business. Win for me is to test my message. I just talked to you guys about testing. Tested my message of whether or not it resonated. You can find me at LinkedIn.
We have a few questions for you.
All right.
Okay. How do you think about frequency and depth of messaging refreshes?
I think I talked about this in terms of keeping a messaging framework a live document. It really depends on your organization, but something I shared recently with my org is product is committing to shipping value every 3 weeks. So if we're committing to shipping value every 3 weeks, I'd argue somebody in my org should be looking at whether or not that messaging framework should be updated. So I think that's a framework of if you have a product development team and they're working in sprints, then that likely is a good framework for you to be like, how could I keep that aligned with that? But I'd argue if you're going beyond 6 months, that's way too long, because ideally that meant that for 6 months your product team didn't do anything that improved the proof points in that messaging house. If that's the case, that could be the case, but that's also a bad case. So it's very unlikely that your product team did nothing. And if they didn't do anything, I would cause a double check to make sure, did you miss something? Because that could be a disconnect between product management and product marketing then.
Okay, and then can you talk more about how you formatted the messaging conversation in your workshop across PMM, product engineering, sales, et cetera?
So what I did for that was actually come up with a couple things. So that was the value prop. So when I led this session, there were a handful of us, it was kind of giving them the task that was, look, I almost created, if it would have been a messaging template, I gave that template to the team and broke them up into different groups and said, I had a version of it I had constructed already. And I said, I want each of you to come from this exercise and then act and construct pieces of it. So we would work together. So I'd have, let's say if it were this table and two of you were my group, I'd say, you two, we're gonna go sit here and work on the product promise. And then you two are also gonna go work on the product promise. What is the product promise? And then we're gonna go do that for 30 minutes and then come back and then share our findings. And then we would align as a group on what that product promise was. Then we'd go back and take the next section of the framework. And I'd be like, okay, you go out here. And for some things, if it would last a little bit longer, I'd be like, okay, you go for 2 hours, go write this. And it's not going to come out of there perfect. What you want to get out of there isn't the exact copy. What you want to do is making sure that you get the ideas. And this is particularly important for us from the technical side, because oftentimes our engineering teams have a vision as future or understand the technology in a different way than even the PM teams do. So particularly if you're finding yourself with the tricky type of one, which I did in that situation, it was one where it's just like, hey, a cross-functioning workshop where I sitting here identifying the best things out of what's coming out of the product might work. Now, some of that is a symptom of broader things. If, oftentimes a lot of that work should be found in some type of discovery document, et cetera. But in that case, I didn't. And if your case, you were like me who didn't have that, this could be a really good framework to use.